Summer Spies, a 100 Halls short story. The door had a privacy rune plastered direct center, which made Vin hesitate when he raised his fist to knock. Was this a standard magical protection, or something individual for the moment, that suggested he should come back later? The man in charge of interns hadn't given instructions on this point. He'd delivered the basic HR policies and a brief explanation of DC's layout, but nothing else. They must have assumed that he knew what he was supposed to do since he was a member of the Academy of Subtle Arts. While he'd excelled at Instructor Pennywhistle's spycraft classes, he felt like a first year again. "Are you going to stand out there all day like a statue or come in and introduce yourself?" said a woman's voice from the other side of the door, startling Vin into action. She had a no-nonsense, gravelly tone that reminded him of Instructor Allgood, but that image fled the moment he stepped through the door. Despite the bottle-blonde coif and the expensive aquamarine pantsuit, Angelica Dallas looked like she regularly gave commands to 3-star generals, and they saluted crisply before carrying out their duties. Vin couldn't quite get a bead on her age, but the hard gaze of her light blue eyes spoke volumes about the weight of her responsibilities. "Nice to meet you, Vincent." Angelica had an iron grip. "Very nice to meet you too," said Vin. "And I prefer Vin." She released his hand, immediately reaching to a pile of folders on her desk. "And I prefer Vincent for the sake of your duties while you work with me this summer." Vin stiffened, and Angelica stared him down. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No, ma'am," he replied. "No, Angelica, we'll be fine. It's bad enough I have to feel old staring at your pink cheeks, but I certainly don't want to be reminded of it." "Come on," she said, brushing past him on her way out the door. "We've got a lot to do today. Try to keep up." As Vin hurried after her, he noted the framed pictures on the wall of Angelica shaking hands with the last 3 U.S. presidents and foreign dignitaries, including a cold-eyed matron and a woman covered in strange tattoos. He'd thought he'd been prepared for this internship, but seeing the level of people she interacted with put a stone in his gut. "May I ask where we're going and what your expectations are for me?" he asked as he rushed to keep up with her quick strides. She was shorter than him by a good half-foot, but her pace left him at her back heel. "I don't have time to train you right now, so keep your mouth shut and your ears and eyes open. We're making a visit to the Nigerian ambassador first. I'll let you know the rest as we get to them," she said. The June heat slammed into Vin when he stepped outside behind his new boss. When he lifted his hand to cast a coolness spell on his skin, Angelica said without even turning her head, "No spells of any kind. And if you have one on you now, get rid of it." By the time they climbed into the black SUV, he had a dribble of sweat running down his back, making his dress shirt stick to his skin. Inside the vehicle was cool at least, giving Vin a respite from the heat. As they pulled away, Vin noted the hard-looking guy in the front seat carried a pistol with mage killer runes on it. Even without testing them, he was sure the windows were magically enhanced. Next to him, Angelica pulled out a datapad and began typing on the screen. Vin resisted the urge to read what she was writing and kept his head facing forward. The vehicle made a few turns, which disoriented Vin, making him lose track of their location. He didn't like not knowing exactly where they were, so he made a note to study the maps again before bed. When they pulled up next to a long squat concrete building, Angelica swept from the vehicle before it fully stopped. Vin hurried to keep up despite having longer legs. She looked ready to kick the door in, but then the moment an attendant swung it open, a change came over his boss. Her shoulders rounded back, her muscles relaxed, and her grim countenance softened. "Kingsley," she said warmly as she shook hands with the ebony-skinned man in the business suit just beyond. "I'm pleased to see you back in the country. A year was a long time to be away. You know how it is, training, catching up on the shifting political structure with the election, but it is good to be back," he said with a wink. "Oh, come now, Kingsley, you sure your return didn't have anything to do with solving that rash of deaths in Abuja?" She cocked a grin. "You don't have to say, but whatever you did, it must have been a good job since they stopped." The ambassador glanced away, adjusted the hem of his jacket. These sort of things usually work out in the end. His face brightened and he flashed a wink. But now I can be here getting ignored by your office. Angelica scoffed. I'm here now. Many apologies for the delay. I was juggling far too many crises. I'll take you out to the new Spanish tapas place in town. The gazpacho is divine. Kingsley's keen eyes fell upon Vin, making him feel self-conscious about his body language. He sucked in his gut and stood straighter. The Nigerian ambassador squeezed Vin's upper arm. New blood, eh? He's a solid fellow. Angelica's gaze swept over him with barely restrained contempt. You know how it goes, someone donates a bunch of money to a PAC and the next thing you know I have a new intern. The comment brought warmth to Vin's cheeks as he averted his eyes. The smile on the ambassador's face faltered. He made a noise in the back of his throat and turned his attention back to Angelica. Well then, said Kingsley as they entered a plush waiting room, where a thin man sat behind a desk in front of an open door. Before they reached the threshold, Angelica snapped her fingers at Vin as if he were a dog. You wait here. The attendant at the desk snickered under his breath as the ambassador and Angelica went into the office. Vin took a spot on the couch, feeling like a piece of toilet paper trailing from a shoe. He resisted the urge to fiddle with his watch. First day? Asked the man behind the desk. Yeah, said Vin with a sigh. Yale. Cornell, he asked. The response caught in his throat. He knew he shouldn't say the 100 halls, but he hadn't formulated a proper answer. He didn't want to say a college that the man might know, probably anything on the East Coast, so he picked a school from the Midwest. Purdue, said Vin in an appropriately neutral accent. The man's face brightened. Oh, do you know Professor Pushkin? I assume you're international studies or poli-sci. Feeling like a deer about to be run over in the middle of the highway, Vin said, linguistics with a math minor. The man blinked before showing a wide grin. Then he went back to working on his computer, without another comment. Vin didn't think he'd done anything wrong, but his gut told him otherwise. He reminded himself that Angelica had told him to keep his mouth shut and his ears open. He'd violated both those orders. With the desk attendant no longer paying attention to him, Vin focused on his surroundings. He had not yet graduated from the academy, but he could put the lessons he'd learned to good use. All those years of the instructors drilling it into their heads that they might not always be able to use magic, came back to him. Vin quieted his inner self and focused on listening, observing his environment and cataloging little things. Even though he knew it was unlikely it would be important, it helped him feel less like he was out of his league. Taking action was always better than waiting. Much like Angelica's wall, pictures displayed the important people the ambassador dealt with, but the one that stuck out was an old photo of him with a woman and small child that Vin assumed was his family. He felt a little pang of jealousy at their happy faces. It was clear by the beaming smiles that they loved their son. Distracted by personal thoughts, Vin refocused on the desk attendant, who took a call, during which he used his name Anofe. He appeared to be in his late 30s based on the wrinkle lines around his mouth, and his accent contained only traces of his Nigerian roots. Outside in the hallway, Vin heard two women talking. The woman named Rose, it seemed, was complaining that her fingernail polish just wouldn't stick anymore, without having to rough it up with a Brillo pad. Around the time he caught a whiff of jasmine drifting into the waiting room, the door to the ambassador's office swung open. It's a shame they won't be at the dinner, but I'll see them next time, said Angelica over her shoulder, but when she turned, her stabbing glance sent his gut through his shoes. He fell in behind her as she gave her farewells to Kingsley. He sensed his boss was like a trigger about to be pulled. As soon as they slipped into the black SUV, Angelica said, "What were my only instructions to you?" Vin's mouth became abysmally dry. He swallowed before saying, "No talking and keep my eyes and ears open." "Did you adhere to my instructions?" she asked from beside him. She was not looking directly at him, but she bristled with annoyance. "No, Angelica." You realize that you've already blown the cover I was planning to use for you. Did you not hear what I said to Kingsley? I brought you with me to this embassy because I knew it was a good place to establish your identity. Your comment about Purdue, yes, I heard that, is easily verifiable, and such a sloppy response will make any further narrative untenable. I thought maybe because you were academy trained, I wouldn't have to hold your hand on every detail, but it seems I was woefully incorrect, she said, holding her anger in her teeth. Angelica shook her head. Why did you not adhere to my instructions? Vin knew no excuse could recover his mistake and lowered his head. The desk attendant asked a question and I answered. In the moment, I was afraid I would be rude if I stayed silent, but I see now that it was a mistake. A mistake is an honest effort going awry. This was disobedience, plain and simple. Tell me why I shouldn't send you back, she said, turning towards him. Gut-rumbling terror threatened to overcome his senses, but Vin knew in that moment that shrinking away from her would only ensure his complete failure. He did the only thing he could think of that might convince her he was worth keeping around. Ambassador Kingsley's office, said Vin, mimicking Enifer's voice down to the hint of Nigerian accent. He is currently in a meeting. May take a message. As soon as he spoke, Angelica's right eyebrow rose slightly, not enough that she was visibly impressed, but a kernel of optimism. A parlor trick, but at least you're not a shrinking violet, she said, turning her focus back to her datapad. As the SUV turned a corner, she spoke again without looking up. The word office was slightly too English, but it was not enough to give it away. He nodded, afraid to do more and ruin the moment. During the next 2 days, Vin went on no more trips with Angelica. Instead, he was sequestered in a back room with a desk and a computer, and given a series of documents to review. He summarized the information and entered it into a database for later dissemination. The documents had been recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Maine. A crewed submarine was being towed by a couple of merpeople, but they'd abandoned it when the Coast Guard caught them on radar. It had been a lucky sighting and unlucky for the crew of 2, as they were spotted over a deep chasm that collapsed the hull before settling on the bottom to be recovered later. While reading through the dry text, Vin imagined himself diving with the merpeople to recover the documents, rather than sitting in a square box with poor ventilation trying to understand the purpose for the covert operation. They found no contraband, only broken vials, shaman charms, licorice root, 2 shirts of chainmail and a dead goat. While they'd been unable to identify the 2 men, the documents suggested they were from South Africa, possibly Sangoma's healers due to the style of the charms. But the reason for sneaking into the country was unclear, since traditional non-hall mages only had to register for entry. Possibly they were going to perform some illegal spells, though the collection of materials made no sense to him. Vin's first thoughts went to the ambassador since they were both from Africa, but he quickly dismissed that idea, since Nigeria and South Africa were as far away from each other as Canada and Mexico. When he was finished with the wreck, his next task was a stack of legal documents. Reading through the dry descriptions of accounting violations for a multinational court, Vin found it hard to keep his eyes open, but he wasn't about to let Angelica down a second time, so he used his imbuement from the academy to stay awake. Even if what he was doing wasn't important, he wanted her to know that he took his responsibilities seriously. During breaks he ate in the cafeteria, where men and women in suits chatted softly amongst themselves. Vin sat alone, using the time to practice his listening skills, not only to feel like he was accomplishing something useful, but to hedge away the loneliness that was leaching like acid on his bones. He missed his friends from the academy. He even missed the instructors, all good included, because he knew where he stood with them. But no respite from the boring clerical work came for Vin. The combination of dry documents and break time observations went on for the rest of the week. He knew all the small gossip and non-classified project work that was going on, including the names of just about everyone in the building. But he was no closer to doing actual academy work, which was why he'd come to the capital. After 10 days of cataloguing documents, Vin hazarded a trip to Angelica's office. As a high-ranking diplomat, it was strange that she had no secretary, but he knocked on the door anyway. "Come in, Vincent." She was sitting on her couch with documents spread around her. Her eyes flashed to him briefly, before returning to whatever she was working on. "I would like to be assigned more important work," he said. She made a clicking noise with her tongue. "What you're doing isn't important." Well, of course it is, but I thought," he said. "You thought this job would be all car chases and splashy magic use," she said. "Sometimes the real work happens between the lines, without a word of a spell or the squeal of a tire. Real work, the kind that moves the needle, often takes people dedicated and observant." After a year in which Vin and his friends went to another realm and pulled off a thrilling heist, sitting in a room reading paperwork was mind-numbing. A significant part of him wanted to give up the summer job, call it quits, and return to Invictus, where he could at least enjoy the time off. Angelica seemed to sense his reluctance, and her gaze narrowed, while the hint of a smile curled the corner of her lips. She was expecting him to give up, which only made him want to stay more. "Anything else?" she asked. "Nothing, Angelica." Vin steeled his expression as he left her office, closing the door behind him. He waited until he was back at his desk before burying his face in his hands. By the third week, Vin had everyone in the building's name and family memorized. He could imitate most of their voices without fail, and knew the DC gossip they were interested in, which included the local sports team, favorite dining spots, and the details about a series of grisly murders that had titillated everyone in town. In addition, he generally knew the teams that were working on 3 separate classified projects by the way they interacted and lowered their voices when together at lunch. 3-inch-long spikes sticking out the dude's chest as if he'd gotten into a bad fight with a giant porcupine, said Sam, a low-level technician on loan from the Defense Department, who Vin knew was currently wooing Sharika from the Infosys group. He wasn't really thinking about what Sam had said, as he usually used the time to let his hearing wander around the room, and then tested himself against his knowledge of them. "Probably a matacore," Vin mumbled to himself, sitting up straight when he heard his own words. A matacore, he thought, probably no way it's a matacore. They're too big, need a big hunting ground like a lion. A creature like that would have been taken care of by the FBSC. He tried to go back to listening to the conversations in the room, but found his thoughts centering back on the matacore idea. He wasn't a supernatural creature specialist, since that was really the purview of Animalian's Hall, but his academy friend, Zane, had seen the head of one in the icehold. Vin pulled up his browser, did a quick search on matacores. They had the body of a lion, leathery bat wings, and the tail of a scorpion, with poison spikes protruding from it that they could fling nearly 50 feet with deadly accuracy. There was a matacore at the Portland Supernatural Zoo, a few held by private collectors, and small populations that lived in remote places like Siberia, the Caucasus Mountains, Central Africa, and the southern tip of Chile and Argentina. It was unlikely that a matacore was roaming the streets of DC, but he couldn't quite shake the idea, so he pulled up the articles about the murders in the local papers. There was no mention of cause of death, not that it was difficult to determine since there were bone spikes sticking out of the guy's chest, nor was there a motive identified. There'd been 2 other deaths like this one, and both had happened about 2 months ago on the same night, but in different locations in town, though the city was small enough that didn't mean much. When Vin got back to his desk, he was supposed to work on another pile of multinational legal documents, but he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept going back to the matacore problem. "I'll just spend a little bit of time on it," said Vin, "just to satisfy my curiosity." But even after an hour, he knew his interest was a combination of boredom and wanting to find a way to impress Angelica. There was no link between the 3 deaths, except that they'd died of bone spikes to the chest, neck, or face. The first death had been the most gruesome, with a spike that went through the woman's right eye, piercing her brain. She'd gone out on an evening run on well-traveled streets, but no one had seen the murder. The same with the other 2. though the last one happened when a man was taking his trash out to the alley behind his 2-story brownstone. He wanted to check the toxicology report, but nothing was mentioned in the papers, and he didn't have access to the morgue or forensic medical reports, but he knew someone in the building that could review them. "What am I going to do? Hey, can I borrow your access to look up reports about a series of murders that have nothing to do with my job?" Vin asked aloud before shaking his head and closing his browser. But an hour later, when he knew that most of the people in the building were headed home, or at least to the bars, Vin went up to the 3rd floor where Sam Waterton's desk was located, broke into his office, picked up his phone and dialed the IS department. It rang twice and then he heard Sharika's voice through the phone. "Hey Sam, what's up?" Vin's stomach flipped. He'd hoped for someone that didn't know Sam. This complicated his plan. He almost hung up. "Hey, sorry to bother you, Sharika," said Vin, mimicking Sam's voice. "I'm super screwed right now, late to turn in a report, and I fumbled my password for the forensics database and got locked out. Can you pull mine up for me, or reset it, and tell me what it is really quick?" There was a moment of silence, followed by a big sigh. "If I didn't know you or see that you're calling from your office, I'd tell you this wasn't policy, but for you, sweetie, I'll happily do it. Thanks, Sharika." A moment later, she read off a list of numbers, symbols and letters, which Vin quickly committed to memory. "I owe you one," said Vin, "and I won't tell anyone about it." "Sure thing, sweetie," she said. "I'll see you later, good luck with your report." After Vin hung up, he smiled internally. Clearly Sam had game, but he wasn't picking up on Sharika's hints. She was clearly into him. Back in his secluded basement office, Vin entered the forensics database and found the reports on the 3 Matticore murders as he was mentally assigning them. While the newspapers had listed the cause of death as impact from foreign object, the actual forensics had classified them additionally as poisonings, though there was nothing about the type of poison, which was unsurprising, since it was difficult to perform a proper toxicology, and it wasn't like the death had been suspicious. After he closed out the forensic database, he pulled up his work files, going back to the first project he'd worked on, the submarine deaths on the coast of Maine. One of the items listed had been a chainmail shirt, 2 of them in fact, which would be very handy against a Matticore. The other items, the charms, a licorice root called impefo, broken vials and a goat, all pointed to the shamans, or Sangoma's healers in this case, attempting to deal with the Matticore. The goat was clearly to bait the Matticore, while the charms and impefo, which was burned by the shamans, was meant to pacify it. Vin hadn't worked out why they'd come over to DC for a Matticore that no one knew existed until 2 months ago, or how the creature was staying hidden in a well-populated city, or even what they planned to do with it once they captured it, if that was their plan. "Unless I'm just completely misreading this," said Vin, exasperated by his sidetrack, when he knew he should be working on his regular duties. He put a hand to his forehead and pushed back his hair. "Angelica will kill me if she finds out I'm investigating this," he thought, then shaking his head, shoved his notes into the desk, cleared his browser and erased every trace he could find of his interest in the Matticore. Vin didn't think about the Matticore for 3 whole days, until he was working on a registry of ship logs for a project from one of the teams on the 3rd floor. His fingers rested on the keys, while the vent above him made a clacking noise as it blew too cold air on the back of his neck. "A crappy submarine like that couldn't have gone that far," he said, scrunching up his face. "It didn't even have a power source, only a couple of merfolk who abandoned it at the first sign of trouble." He saved his work and dove back into the ship database, pulling up the dates around when the crewed submarine had been spotted by the Coast Guard. Hundreds of ships had been through the area, though most were fishing vessels and unlikely to be involved with this obscure plot. When he sorted the list by size and nationality, an answer stuck out. NNS Okpebana. Nigerian Navy ship. But what would the ambassador have to do with the Matticore? Vin asked himself. Details that he'd previously missed came into focus. Using his best approximation of Angelica's voice, he said, "Oh, come now, Kingsley, you sure your return didn't have anything to do with solving that rash of deaths in Abuja?" You don't have to say, but whatever you did, it must have been a good job since they stopped. He hesitated. I'm pleased to see you back in the country. A year was a long time to be away. What connected murders in Nigeria's and the United States capitals? The timing of both coincided with the ambassador's presence. Vin pulled up the calendar of political events from the days of the murder, finding that in both cases the ambassador was present at a black tie affair, which gave him hundreds of prominent alibis. But despite that evidence, Vin still felt like the ambassador was involved. Too many things added up. What he needed now was a way to find the Manticore and predict when it would attack again, which he knew would only come with more information. Ambassador Kingsley lived a few blocks from Embassy Row, which meant heightened security. Vin passed at least 3 black SUVs on his jog, which took him down the street on a long loop. He'd been running each night after work to keep fit, but changed his route to include the ambassador's residence. As part of Vin's routine, he stopped at the little park nearby, sitting on a bench that faced the ambassador's house. He never stayed for long, fiddling with his phone as he adjusted his playlists, maybe tying his shoe, then he continued on his run. By the 3rd day, he'd established that the ambassador was usually out late, while his wife and teenage son moved around the house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and the house received no unusual visitors. The son, Deo, went to a local private high school, played tennis, and seemed like an ordinary kid. The wife, Keisha, stayed mostly at home. On the 8th night of his surveillance, a cloudy evening that threatened rain, the mood of the house changed considerably. When Vin stopped at the park bench, the chiffon yellow curtains which were normally open had been pulled tight. 2 Nigerian security guards stood outside the front door, and the ambassador's personal vehicle was on the street. Rather than continue his run, Vin stayed on the bench, messing with his phone while he had the sound off. Using his imbuement, he listened for voices inside the house, but wherever the ambassador and his family were, only muffled noises reached Vin. While he waited, 2 security guards from the nearest black SUV approached his bench. They wore Armani suits, but Vin sensed the bulges beneath the coats. "Excuse me," said the beefy guy in front who looked like he could bench press a small car. "You really need to move along now." Vin, who was no small man himself, kept his shoulders clenched and his hat down. He waited until they were closer to flinch as if he'd just seen them, then thumbed his phone and removed the earbud out of his right ear. "Sorry, hello. Can I help you?" asked Vin. The 2 guys looked at each other as if to say, "Can you believe this kid? Move along." "Scram," said the security guy. "Pick a different jogging route. You're here too much." "This is a free country, right?" asked Vin, taking on airs. "Not here," said the beefy security guy. "If I dragged your ass over to that sidewalk, that's foreign soil, and then if my fist accidentally messed up your face, it wouldn't be my fault." Vin knew the worst thing he could do was to react negatively to the insult. He kept himself calm, which was probably the only reason he happened to hear the faint crashing inside the ambassador's residence, and caught the shape moving across the building top. "Fine, whatever," he said, shoving his earbud back in and circling wide around the 2 guards, moving in the direction he saw the rooftop shadow travel. The creature, he decided it was a creature by the way it moved on 4 legs as it leapt over the gaps between the houses, traveled much faster than a human could go, which forced Vin to use his speed imbuement. He tried to use it sparingly as not to give away his magical abilities, but the creature was fast. He didn't want to assign the label of Manticore to it yet, since it clearly wasn't as large as a lion, nor did it have wings that he could see. Even with his sensing imbuments, it was difficult to make out the creature against the cloudy night sky. Only the streetlights reflecting on the low clouds gave him the opportunity. Vin lost the creature when it headed north from his position, which forced him to circle wide around the street looking for signs of its passage. He stopped at a corner, heartbeat pounding in his ears, listening for the creature. As he was spinning in a slow circle like a radar installation looking for incoming enemy planes, it occurred to him that it was almost a month since the last attack. Vin thumbed up his phone to find that it was a full moon today and had been on the previous attacks, which made the pieces of the problem fall into place. "Oh shit," he said. When he heard a crash, followed by a scream from the alleyway behind the row of houses to his right, Vin took off without regard for observers. He snatched the lid off a trash can on his way into the alley, finding a menacing shape in the shadows facing down a woman cowering against a brick wall. The shape stood on two legs, while a scorpion tail waved hypnotically behind him, bristling spikes sticking from the bulbous tip. Vin sensed rage in the creature, the blind obedience to his nature. "Deo," said Vin, holding up the lid like a shield and keeping his reflexes on a hair trigger. "Leave the woman alone." The ambassador's son Deo spun around, his tail snapping like a whip. Vin barely got the trash can lid up to intercept the incoming missiles. The bone spikes shot through the thick plastic lid, but were deflected enough that they sailed past his head. Hoping that Deo couldn't fire his spikes again, Vin rushed him, using the lid like a shield and preparing for a shoulder charge. The ambassador's son turned, took 2 steps, and leapt over the woman onto the brick wall. He scurried up the corner crenellations and was on the roof before Vin could even skid to a stop. Tossing the torn trash can lid down, Vin ran the other way, hoping to circle around and catch Deo before he could escape. While he could have followed Deo onto the roof, Vin knew he was faster on the streets. As he ran the direction he thought Deo had gone, he could no longer sense him. After a few blocks of circling and stopping occasionally to listen, Vin knew he'd lost him. He'd kept the kid from killing another, but there was no guarantee for the rest of the night. But more importantly, he'd found the source of the murders. Vin returned to his apartment and prepared to see Angelica the next day to tell her what he'd found. "Come in." The way Angelica said it made him feel like she knew he was coming, but it could have been his nerves. He hadn't slept all night. As he walked in, he noticed the smudges of pen on the meat of his palm from writing notes, fleshing out what he believed had been going on, so he shoved his hands behind his back, assuming an at-rest position. Angelica's sour expression punched a hole right in Vin's gut. "For an intern, you require a lot of personal attention. Shall I get you a nappy or a cup of tea?" Vin had a whole speech prepared that he'd hoped would impress her, but the quip triggered a gag reflex of crude explanation. "I solved the DC murders," he said, letting his chin rise slightly. She raised her hands, gave him a slow clap. "Are we the blue shirts now? Do we care about petty crimes and misdemeanors? Did Timmy Whiteshoes jaywalk on 5th Street? Shall we issue him a citation?" The cold calculation in her gaze left him wrong-footed. He wanted to fire back, but stifled his retort behind squeezed lips. Something about the way she held herself told him he should be cautious. "It's Ambassador Kingsley's son, Deo. He's a shape-shifting Manticore hybrid like a werewolf," said Vin. Angelica made no reaction. She might have well been a statue, an extremely disapproving statue, but immobile nonetheless. "Your proof?" he asked without a trace of inflection. Vin took a slow inward breath, calming his pulse. "The best as I can tell, Deo contracted his therianthropy when they returned to Nigeria for a family vacation. I think it happened on a camping trip near Nairobi. That's why the ambassador didn't return to the US in his official capacity, because he was dealing with his son's condition." "Does the Nigerian government know about his son's condition?" asked Angelica. "I don't think so." "Don't think so?" she asked. Kingsley went to great lengths to delay his return to the US, fearing it would be harder to control here, nor could he tell his superiors. So he had to utilize his connections, mates from boarding school. He tried to smuggle 2 sangomas or South African healers into the country to cure Deo, said Vin. "Would it have worked?" he asked. Vin hesitated. "I don't know. While I know traditional non-hall mages can be effective, usually along a narrow band, whether or not they could have fixed Deo remains unknown." Angelica steepled her fingers. "I see." A pause. "And how did you learn this?" "The work I've been doing, cataloging. I made the connection with the murders, and what I'd overheard when I was at the Nigerian embassy with you," said Vin. The long, quiet pause felt like waiting for an execution. When the corners of her eyes creased, Vin steeled himself. "And did you acquire any classified information during this investigation? Or was this all using non-classified sources?" said Angelica. The hole in his gut became a pit. "Yes, ma'am, I mean Angelica. I faked Sam Waterton's voice to acquire his password so I could review the morgue forensics. The presence of poison in the victims led me to figure out the importance of the submarine shamans." "Thank you for being honest with me," said Angelica as she leaned back in her chair. "Though we were already aware of your violation. You don't think we don't verify password changes and other inconsistencies?" She sighed. "I'm afraid I must terminate your employment at this facility. The State Department is not a good fit. Goodbye." The sentence was like a hammer blow to the chest. Vin couldn't even choke out a rebuttal. Angelica leaned over, pressed a button on a desk phone, and said, "Security. You can come pick up Vincent Moretti now. He will be outside my office. He will be allowed to collect any personal items before leaving the building." Vin shuffled from her office in a daze. It wasn't like he hadn't been fired before, but this was a job that mattered. Instructor Pennywhistle would be so disappointed in him. The security guard gave him a cardboard box with the top cut off to hold the few items he'd bothered bringing with him. Eyes followed him as he walked through the building, the cardboard box, a scarlet letter branded on his forehead. He was dizzy as he made the final walk through security, men and women in suits eyeing him sideways as he clutched the box to his chest. The burning in his cheeks could have started a fire. When he finally stumbled outside, the sun was a spotlight in his eyes. The security guard took his badge and promptly closed the door behind him. Knowing fresh air would do him some good, Vin opted to walk back to his apartment rather than take the subway. During the zombie march, he catalogued all the ways he'd screwed up with Angelica, his job. The list filled him with shame. Vin was so focused on his mistakes he didn't notice the black SUV with tinted windows roll up next to him until it had been there for a good 24 feet. It stopped when he did, and when the window slid down, Angelica's perfect blonde coif looked back at him. "Get in," she said, nodding towards the other side of the vehicle. "I don't need a ride home, the walk feels good," said Vin. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "You're not going home." Her words felt like a hard flick against the forehead, snapping him awake. "I'm not." "No," she said. "You're headed to your new job." Her exact words when she'd fired him filtered through his brain until his jaw was hanging open. "Careful, Vincent, you might catch flies." Before she could change her mind, Vin clamped his mouth closed and hurried to the other side of the SUV. As soon as he was inside, they pulled away. Angelica studied him as he sat next to her, clutching his box. "I thought I'd screwed up one too many times," he said. "You did," she said. "I was a few days away from firing you for breaching the forensic system." "Why didn't you?" he asked. "Curious to why you needed it. So I let it play out," she said. "Glad I did." "So you can use the Deo situation?" he asked. "Use? Why, this is wonderful leverage," said Angelica. "We have tools at our disposal to help his son with his therapy problem, which will put his father severely in our debt." "And no more murders in DC," said Vin. Angelica's forehead knotted. "Of course no murders." He looked away, blinked. "What is my new job?" "Central Bureau of Supernatural Intelligence," said Angelica. "The job will be similar to how I wanted to use you in the State Department, but maybe in a role more suited to your gifts." "Who will I report to?" he asked. "Me," she said with a little laugh. He pursed his lips together, before remembering the pictures on her wall. "You're not just a diplomat," he said. "Nice of you to finally catch on," said Angelica with a cagey lilt to the corner of her lips. She was a completely different personality than the one he'd encountered at the State Department, which made him question every interaction he'd ever had with her. As if she'd been reading his mind, she said, "Pay attention, Vincent. The job only gets harder from here on out. But I only have another 6 weeks until I return to the halls." Angelica winked. "Then we have a lot of work ahead." This has been Summer Spies by Thomas K. Carpenter.